Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. My name is Amanda Hornberger. I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks, and I'm excited to welcome you to our last pre-event for Violins of Hope Reading. The exhibit opens next Monday, November 1st, and we're thrilled that you're here to learn more about the project. I'm excited to introduce Daniel Levin. He's a contemporary artist whose work primarily addresses social justice issues. He holds an MFA in visual art from the Vermont College of Fine Arts and a BFA in documentary photography from the Rochester Institute of Technology. And he's a tenured associate professor of photography. And I'm so excited to learn more about your new project, Violins and Hope. Thanks, Daniel.
Sorry, I was on mute.
No problem.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you, all of you who attended tonight. I guess there isn't a Philly Eagles game, or maybe there is this evening. So thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be part of this huge celebration. I guess that's the right word. I think it's the right word, of Violins of Hope. And I know that you've had Jake Grimes come and virtually and be involved in a talk, a book sharing, and that my dear friend Avshi is soon going to be joining you in Reading from Istanbul, and the violins are coming in, and all the other programming. So it's really nice to be here. Would you like me to just dive right in, Amanda?
Yeah, please go right ahead.
Okay. So, so I'm sure many of you know about what the mission of Amnon Weinstein is. And I say is because while he's in his 80s, he's still thick into his projects. There are people still bringing him violins and other string instruments that they know in most cases were directly involved in a Holocaust survivor or someone who wasn't a survivor, usually a member of their family. Sometimes Amnon does not know the specific story, and he does the best that he can to kind of forensically figure out what he can. I will tell you, I will share, first of all, I'd like to tell you that I'm here because of not only my exhibition, but my book. And the book has, I've been speaking lately, but I have not gotten the book yet. The books are en route from Singapore, but just a few nights ago, I received 40 for my opening. They were airshipped as opposed to ship-shipped. And I can show it to you. You're the first group that will see the real thing. It's been a long birth, much longer than 9 months, but here she is. So for those of you that, is it safe to assume everyone knows the mission of Amnon, Amanda? Yes. Okay.
I think most people know, but it doesn't hurt if you want to go over it one more time.
Okay.
That's not a problem.
So Amnon's father was named Moshe, and his mother was Golda, and they immigrated from Europe, Eastern Europe, prior to the war. And he was already a trained luthier from three of Cremona, Italy's finest luthiers, master luthiers. And a luthier, of course, is a violin maker. Unfortunately, after the war, he found that 100% of his family were killed. And I don't mean immediate family. I'm talking about going back a generation or two and cousins. And we're talking into the hundreds. So he was the sole survivor, only because he immigrated. And he immigrated to Tel Aviv. He's always been a big believer in community and giving back and helping children and great performers alike. In fact, Yitzhak Perlman lived behind his workshop, and he mentored him along with Shlomo Mintz and some of the other great Israeli prodigies who now are, adults far into their careers. I think what I'll do is share some of the book with you, and that will help give you some visuals to the narrative. Eventually, I'd like to open it up for questions. All I can tell you is I'd like to share with you the way this came about first. So I have co-curated a few shows with my friend Israel Weiner, who now lives in Tel Aviv, but used to live in Jerusalem. And he was with Israel TV for many years. He was a shaliach to Cleveland, and later went back to Israel with his family, and then became a kind of arts liaison. And we have a very, very active federation here, bringing great Israeli artists, architects, dance, theater, sculpture, and music and other arts. And we bring them every year. And usually the programming is open and targeted, frankly, to the larger community, not just the Jews, who primarily are on the east side of Cleveland. Amnon and I, Israel and I co-curated a show on a man named Solomon Ubermen, who was living in the Pale of Settlement. And he and his uncle, S. Ansky, many of you know the story of Dibuk, the great mythological creature. He wrote it, Ansky wrote it. And during that time, around 1910, there was actually, it was between like 1909 to 1911, before World War I broke out. It was really popular to study people of a given culture. And in this case, we're talking about Africa and other places like that, Asia, but he was interested in studying his own people. This is after he became famous, and he was actually allowed to live in a big city as opposed to living out in the Pale Settlement. Point is that his nephew was this teenager who was an incredible photographer and later became a master block printer. And so anyhow, Israel and I co-curated a show on these photographs, environmental portraits that were done in the Pale of Settlement prior to World War I of Jews. And they're incredible. They had never been shown in America. And while he was in town, he asked me if I had heard of Violins of Hope. And all I could think was, well, I haven't, but it sounds really sentimental, almost sappy sentimental. And he told me about it. And he told me about it because Violins of Hope was going to be coming almost 2 years later to Cleveland. And so most of you know what that is. They're violins that have survived the Holocaust miraculously, because we're talking about instruments that weigh around a half pound, that are thin wood, that are susceptible to humidity and other kinds of weather. And it's just miraculous that any of these exist. These violins, well, anyhow, let me get back to the point of how this came about. So he told me about all the programming, and I know you're having a lot of programming in Reading. There was a massive amount of programming here. In fact, it was the largest shared cultural experience programming in Cleveland's history of the largest arts organizations at the CEO level. And I could go on about that, but I won't. All I'll say is that it seemed to me when I heard about the programming that I was just, as a photographer, I was just curious about who's this man? What does a luthier do? What does a luthier do who needs to restore violins that aren't just old, but were really terribly cared for the last 60 years, and especially during the war. And what was, what's his workshop like? What does it smell like and all of that? And I just wondered, who has the gall to do this project and the knowledge and the need to, because he lost all of his father's family. So that's what I was interested in. And that's really what my book is about. So Jay Grimes is incredible. I consider that book to be mandatory reading. It goes into the backstories of so many of these violins that Amnon has, and it's incredible. I could read it over and over again, and I love Jay. My book is very much tailored to this man and what he does and the larger mission. And I had no idea when I started. When I got a grant, I went to Tel Aviv and I did a still photography documentary on Amnon, and we kind of lived together for 4 days. But I had no idea that it would eventually become a book. And once I dove into it, and I met this incredible publisher who only does books on place. In fact, he started a 501c3 called the Center of the Study of Place. And he does high-end photography books. But I had no idea that there would be so much text. let alone the layering of stories that still astounds me. And it really evolved into something. In fact, I'll tell you now, I received an email from a man named Christian Lloyd last week, and he's out of London, and he's the managing editor of the Strad magazine. And I'm not a musician, but I think you all know what Strad means. So he's the managing editor of the definitive publication for high-end instruments, followed by subscribed by players and luthiers alike. And he wanted to see if he could get an early copy of the book. So that's very exciting. So anyhow, that's kind of how it came about. So maybe I'll share now some photos with you. First, I'll show you just a little taste of what the book looks like, and then I'm going to go to a different software. I can find it. There we go. So that's the page. It's not the cover. Imagine these are 2-page spreads, and this is the second and third page. What you're looking at here on the left is
right now it's just a blank screen. I did see it said Violins of Hope, but then you click something else, and now I just see a blank screen.
You do, okay. It's still a blank screen? Okay.
For me it is, yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Try it one more time.
I see it right there.
All right, I'm afraid to touch another key. We'll see.
Thank you.
Do you see anything?
I do. Yep, it looks good.
Okay. By the way, you'll see the foreword was written by Franz Welser Most. Franz is the music director and conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra. And he's, even last year, the New York Times called the Cleveland Orchestra, they name it the Cleveland. That's their pet name. And the title of their article was, the Cleveland is still the best. Actually, I'm misquoting that. It's something just like that, which is really amazing. But Franz was born in Austria, and his father fought for the other side. And he wrote this incredibly personal essay as a foreword. So between his background being Austrian and his scholarship in music, I could not have found a better person. What are we looking at on the left here? If there isn't a label from the maker of the violin, and it's a Holocaust violin, Amnon creates a dedication label. And the last word you may see here, Bilski, on the left side. Of course, Hebrew goes backwards. And so this violin is actually in memory of his wife's parents. Assail Bilski. And he is a very famous person from a very famous family. I'll tell you about that later. So anyhow, this gives you a taste. It's a 12 by 10 book. It was printed in Singapore and designed by a Jewish book designer who used to be in New York and is now in Santa Fe. And he's designed books for the Met and MoMA and so on. But he also happens to be, I found out in the middle of the project, his mom is a 7th generation Palestinian Jew. So her family, going straight back, has been in Jerusalem since the late 1700s. So to her, she calls it Palestine, although she just passed away. Anyhow. It's going slowly. Here's the foreword with a bow. Now, if this isn't large enough, I can make the pictures bigger and not show any of the text. Would you prefer that?
I think it's large enough. I can see it quite fine. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So this is his essay, and the pre-order books are available, but they're not coming in until November. So this is one of the Amnon, believe it or not, workshop is in a Bauhaus building. Like, who would guess that this place I had imagined in my mind's eye was this kind of dusty, varnishy smelling place with like a Geppetto-like figure. And this is before I even knew what Amnon looked like. Well, the truth is, it is incredibly rich inside. But the outside is a German design, the Bauhaus school. It's in the middle of a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO site, the largest place of Bauhaus buildings in the world. So it's quite ironic that the Jews were fleeing Eastern and Western Europe only to settle, the ones that came to Tel Aviv, many of them settled in German design buildings, which are cherished today. This is a map that I will tell you about later, but it is really an incredible story. What you're looking at here is one wall in Amnon's office that his parents used to live upstairs, directly above in this building. And just to the left is a door, and it's where Amnon's father Moshe's workshop was, which is basically a big closet. The rest is Amnon's office now. And then in the building, a sister building next door is his workshop. And my pictures go back and forth between the two places. This is an essay about what happened before and after going to Tel Aviv that I wrote. This is, tell you a little backstory here. Maybe you've heard, some of you have heard of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver. Rabbi Silver was the rabbi at the temple in Cleveland, and he had a mission for 8 months. He represented the entire population of Jews, the Jews of the world, including American Jews, going back and forth to the General Assembly in New York. Actually, I think it's New Jersey, because this was before the building was finished on First Avenue. And he kept his pulpit here, and he went back and forth lobbying for a two-state solution. And here he is speaking. His hand is raised, and he has command of the room. And seated behind him and to the left is a little lady from Wisconsin, Golda Meir, listening. So it gives you a sense of kind of his status. And he's actually the one that eventually flew there to say, thank you, General Assembly. This morning, Israel became a nation state. And I found that audio recording. And in the back of my book, there are a number of references that suggest readings, recordings, and films, and why you might want to check them out. And that's available to listen to on the web. Anyhow, I restored this. It's from the UN archives. And ironically, it's kind of crazy. It's kismet. If this was not the reason that this orchestra performance happened in Cleveland. I understand that Amanda was involved in showing the documentary, the PBS documentary that was produced here in Cleveland. And part of that was about the Cleveland Orchestra performance. Well, the Cleveland Orchestra performance was the very first time, even though other orchestras had played on some of these violins, there was never a full symphony playing a full symphony performance. This was the very first one, and it happened to be in a house that's kind of a European-looking synagogue that was Abba Hillel's, and if it wasn't for his lobbying, there might not have been a two-state solution. And here, this concert happened there with these violins that exist today as a memorial to the Holocaust. So it was a really weird kismet. This was an early exhibition of mine in Phoenix, and it went on to San Francisco. It was supposed to go to Fort Wayne, into a town outside of, I think it was Sioux City, but COVID happened. So anyhow, there's a brand new exhibition that's in a very different form that's going to be traveling across the country and abroad, and it's opening here on the 14th. The prints are larger, they're framed, and I have shipping cases made. So anyhow, so this is Amnon, and he's in his office, and he's corresponding with a client after he had a day's work. In the case are some of the Holocaust violins. This is of the Auschwitz violin. This, maybe Jay Grimes talked with you about it. But unfortunately, when Amnon takes apart a violin, which a luthier always does to improve it, he takes the peg out of the back and looks through, and that was his first indication that there were ashes inside of it. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. By the way, I should tell you that, and Avshi will talk about this when he comes, what Amnon does is absolutely against all rules for a curator of, let's say, a antiquities museum, or maybe not antiquities, but a history museum. So you don't touch these precious objects. You clean them up and you present them in a case, and there you go. Amnon had this epiphany, and I'm sure Jay probably told you about this. While these violins truly saved lives of the musicians that performed on them, maybe saved lives for a little while, maybe before they were killed, or maybe they survived. They also brought some moments, 5 minutes, 10 minutes of humanity in a place where there was humanity for all those who could listen. Where were they played? Certainly they were played when the Jews were forced off the cattle cars in the camps. The idea was the Germans felt that if there was this music playing, they would think, can't be so bad. Where was I going to go with this? I don't know. Oh, I know what I was going to say. So Amnon's mission is to really take them apart and take wood off of them and improve their sound, in some cases, even to the degree that it's possibly better than it was when it was new. Some of these instruments are not high-end instruments at all. And he has that ability. It's amazing. And so why would you do this? Well, these violins were vilified. I don't know if that's the right word, but they were stigmatized. So people didn't want to play them in spite of the humanity that were brought to people's lives, or even saving lives. So they would be put in attics. I'm talking about the ones primarily in Israel, and eventually brought to Moshe, Amnon's father. And Moshe couldn't restore them because no one would buy them. They were stigmatized. And so he just kept accumulating them. And one day, when Amnon was a luthier, and he went to Cremona, Italy, and studied under 3 of the master luthiers of his time, it occurred to him that if he restored one, and it could be played, that potentially the story of the Holocaust could be experienced in an incredibly visceral way, and in a beautiful way that words can't even convey. After all, a violinist will tell you that a violin has its own voice, certainly its own marks as well. In the art world, we call it index, mark making from use. And so between that and the sound, it's truly like you're hearing the person or the few people who owned it during that era. It's amazing. I've had the experience of being in the room as these are played by an orchestra. So when the ultimate metaphor, I believe this was covered in that documentary, but I'm not sure. Amnon was asked for the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. He was asked by the foreign secretary of Germany to consider, please fly to Berlin, we'll pay for you. We would like some of the violins to come, and we would like some members of the Berlin Philharmonic to perform on them. You can imagine the metaphor, kind of power, knowing that Amnon's family was wiped out, Moshe's family was wiped out. And so he did go, and they gave him a huge recognition, a medal. And while there, the foreign minister asked Amnon, would you please allow me to visit you in Cleveland, in Tel Aviv the next time I'm there? And Amnon said, yes, that would be wonderful, thank you. And so by chance, I didn't know this was going to happen, but Amnon was visited by 3 members of the foreign minister's staff while I was there to check out security and all that. He was going to come the next week. And so that's what's happening here. And I too lost a wing of my family. The last name is Peteshnikov. and they were all wiped out, including a rabbi in the family. So for Amnon to have the foreign minister of Germany visit him in his workshop, or fly him to Berlin and so on, have that experience, it's kind of like Hitler didn't win. I mean, that's really how Amnon sees it. And in a little way, that's kind of how I felt being in the room as well. It was powerful, even though this isn't the foreign minister himself. So this is a violin that Amnon received from Germany, owned by a non-Jew. And the non-Jew found out about Amnon's project worldwide. People are finding out about it. And he offered it to Amnon. And Amnon said, send me some pictures, and he did, and Amnon ended up buying it. In most cases, he doesn't buy them. He was very excited by this because he hadn't received a German violin from Germany yet. And so he opened it while I was there because it arrived that morning. And so he's kind of examining it in a forensic way. And I describe this in the exhibition, what he's doing in each case. He makes a label for each. And often will not even open up a violin. He'll leave it open in a case for months and just live with it until he's ready. This is an incredible story. I'm going to take a moment to read it to you. This is the only story of Amnon's in the book. One moment, I'm going to just change something here. So I'll read this to you. My publisher asked me to consider asking Amnon a question that was really significant from my point of view. And so I called him. And by the way, I called him yesterday, I FaceTime with him. Don't tell Avshi this. I called him, and Amnon takes naps in the afternoon. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. I do it too. But I called at about 7 in the morning yesterday, and it's, I don't know, something like 2 there. And he answers, and he's speaking Hebrew to, and I know he's seeing me, but I think he's still kind of asleep, and he's speaking Hebrew. And I'm like, Amnon, it's Daniel. Amnon. He's like, I know. And so then he started in English, but the whole conversation, his head was on the pillow and his eye patch was on his forehead. And I had to turn my head as we spoke, but I got a chance to share the book with him, and it was really touching. And then later in the day, Asi called as well, his wife, and I interview her in the back of the book. All right, so this is what he said. Take a sip of water. By the way, this morning in Europe time, Amnon was interviewed by French television about this story I'm about to read to you. And Amnon's fluent in French. On November 16th, 2020, Daniel asked Amnon to comment on the process, in particular, how the restoration of a Holocaust violin compares to the repair and fine-tuning of an old violin that did not live through the Holocaust. These are Amnon's words. Very simple. A Holocaust violin has history behind it, and the history is holding you back because you're doing something which is abnormal, of course. The violins that are coming from the Holocaust are in very bad shape, and a normal violin would never arrive in such shape, never ever, because the Holocaust violin owners could not keep them well. The violins from the concentration camps are even in worse condition than those from the ghettos. The violins from the ghettos might still be able to be somewhat cared for, but the violins from the camps are always in terrible condition. No violin will play 1 minute in rain, and many of the violins I have suffered terribly from rain. By the way, last I knew, he was up to 86 violins. When you're holding a violin like this, I usually, but not always, know the story. It's as if you're holding a holy piece. You try to make no mistakes with what you're doing, but there are mistakes in your work. It's difficult, very difficult. And usually I'm thinking about the people who played on this violin and the people who heard the music, both of them. Nothing is normal when you're doing this. It's too much weight. You know, as an example, we're currently doing something on Israeli television with a violin that belonged to a Gentile French police officer who saved Jewish children in his house. His violin was in working condition because he was at home. Most Holocaust violins were outside. The story will cut you to pieces. There had been 3 Jewish children and their mother asked a couple to care for them. Eventually, the children didn't want to stay without their mother any longer, so the mother came back and got them. Some days later, the Gestapo took them away, finished. Recently, I had a meeting in my workshop with the French police officer's son. The couple was the French police officer and his wife. He brought me the violin that his father had when he and his mother cared for these Jewish children. We were sitting and talking about everything in my office, and then he showed us a picture of these 3 children. You know, when we were finished saying goodbye, he saw that I had in my workshop a book by the famous French Nazi hunter, Serge Klarschfeld, the guy who caught many of the bad German people. That's broken English. There is one particular book that Klarsfeld made about many of the Jewish children in front of where the Germans killed the children. The officer's son knew about the book, but he didn't own it, and he had never seen a copy of it. As he opened to look at it, as he saw it, boom, he was pointing at the photo of the 3 kids, the children whose parents had cared for, the ones he told me about just 5 minutes before. He was beginning to tremble. His wife, she didn't know what to do. And all of us, we had, well, you can imagine. And then he goes on to talk about restoration of violins that have survived. So anyhow, and I asked him, can you send me a photograph of the cover of the book and of the picture? And he said, sure. And he sent me this iPhone picture that was taken at an angle, and it was just, took forever, but I restored them. And these are the 3 and the cover of the book. So here he's restoring, and this is one thing I must share with you. I consider the bottom left picture on the right-hand page a very mundane photograph, but to me, it's the most powerful photograph in the whole exhibition and the whole book. Why? Because his process of restoring these is incredible. So there's this wooden platen that looks like a violin shape, and then there's felt on it. And he's been working on the same one for ages, using that platen. So he puts the violin, as you can see, the top of the violin, the top right photograph. By the way, his grandkid is calling from Turkey. And so like any good grandpa, he stops his work and answers the FaceTime call. But anyhow, he takes this platen and he uses a small finger lathe, and he moves some wood off of it, and he puts it up to his ear, which you see in the bottom left corner, and he goes, which is basically the sound of ding. And he uses his finger and he hits a spot. And then he uses a caliper, which you're seeing in the bottom right corner, and he measures the thickness in that spot, sets it down on the platen, gets his finger plane, and moves the wood. And how you teach that, I don't know. I mean, to me, that's magic. How many places can you click on or tap on the top or bottom of a violin? It's infinite. And yet each part sounds different. And anyhow, that's what he does. He taught his son Avshi, who you're all going to have a wonderful opportunity to meet. Avshi didn't go to Cremona, but he studied under his dad, who's a master. And he has his own luthier shop in Istanbul. And he's an incredible luthier. So you can ask Avshi how you learn that, because to me, it's magic. Amnon has a collection of some of the greatest string instrument players, Jewish, conductors and composers. He has this collection that's certainly one of a kind in the world, and he looks at these almost like he's a boy or girl and 10-year-old who's following pro baseball with baseball cards. It's an incredible collection. Someday I assume they'll go into a museum. I would be, shooting, and I'd turn around and he would be resting from working, and he would be moving pictures around like a little kid. He didn't do it as a performance for me, I assure you. So I'm going to fly through some of these so there's time to, we're wrapping at 8, or what time?
Yeah, I think around 8 o'clock. So whatever
Okay.
you want to talk about. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat a while and we can get to those.
Okay, I'm just going to fly through these. These are called the plates. And this is the very first plate. And some of you that read Hebrew, you'll see, I read Hebrew, but I don't understand it aside from like 50 words or something. But I can read the top buzzer. It says Weinstein. And so for all these years, all these incredible, some of the world's greatest performers would push this buzzer, or children. And Amnon's just as interested in the children as he is the prodigies and the greatest professionals of the day. Backstory here, I don't know if there's time because I want to answer questions, but if there's time, I'll tell you the story to this. Certainly, maybe you'll even have this violin in Reading.
Yeah, this violin will be at the Goggle Works, so you can come see it in person.
Great. This is an unplayable violin. It reminds me when I was a kid, I remember Henny Youngman he was like a comedian and would use a violin occasionally. Violin never worked, and this poor kid who has holes in his shoes and his clothes are tattered used it as a prop on the street to try to panhandle and get money. There is a violin just like this in the collection, and you'll see it in my book here. This is Amnon's father-in-law, and I have to tell you this story because it's a really important part of their lives and of this book, and it's incredible. And that is that Amnon's wife, Asi, is the daughter of Asel Bilski, and he is one of the 3 most famous Bilskis. There are actually 4 brothers. There was a younger one as well. And those of you that have seen the film Defiance know the whole story, although it's Hollywood, but it's, according to Asi, really very much based on truth. They flew Asi's mother, Avshalom's grandmother, to the set. I don't remember what country it was, so she could be there for some of the filming. Asi never had this picture. She never had a picture of her dad. It was only when she was an adult that one of the brothers in New York, two of the brothers moved to New York. Her dad was killed. He was forced into the Russian army. He was killed 2 months before she was born. But at any rate, they saved 1,247 Jews in the forest. And how you feed 5 Jews of the forest for 2 years in the winter when you might not have shoes, when there isn't a grocery store, and if you leave the forest and you're caught, you're going to be shot. It's a miracle. And they lived in the forest for over 2 years, and no children were allowed to be born, but if children were discovered, they could be brought there. And so not only did they save more Jews than any other Jewish family in all of World War II, but they were known as the Bilski partisans, and they blew up trains and they killed Nazis and they sent girls on their bikes into town. Jay writes about it, and to blow up a power plant. The youngest Bilski, I think I have it written here, he may have been 10, something like that. And he would sneak into the ghetto to steal children from the ghetto and bring them into the forest. This is the first book about the Bilskis. Plaque of Theodor Herzl, of course, founder of the concept of the State of Israel. You can see the marks of these tiny little planes, these huge planes carpenters usually hold in their hand. This fits between your thumb and your index finger. So I'm going to fly through here. This is a letter from the director of the Berliner Philharmonic. I just happened to find it. This is documentary photography. It was sitting in a pile, and he wrote to Amnon to say, I hope you enjoyed all of the programming that happened in Berlin while you were there. This is a coin. All these coins, I can almost guarantee you Amnon hasn't even looked on the shelf in probably 10 years. I was looking under things and there was stuff everywhere. This coin represents Branislav Ubermen and the great conductor Toscanini, and the first, I think, 10 performances of the Palestine Philharmonic. Uberman, I'll tell you more about him in a second, but In short, Toscanini found out about what Ubermen was planning. Ubermen was probably the greatest violinist at the age of 14 in all of Europe. And later he had this dream to save these Jews before they were killed, 90 members, paid out of his pocket, and flew them with their family to create the Palestine Philharmonic from nothing. It's like starting with the World Series caliber orchestra. Anyhow, Toscanini was so impressed with the idea that Ubermen had to create an orchestra in this new state of Israel that was going to be a new state of Israel, that he offered to conduct these first 10-ish concerts. And he did come, and he wouldn't charge a dime. He didn't charge a dime. And they were also in Egypt. And that map at the beginning of the book represents where those concerts were. Mm. Some of the clippings from Amnon's renowned clients that Amnon's desk. One of the calipers. These are actually gypsies, not Jews, but Nazis were forcing them to perform on the street. And I asked Amnon, he said the gypsies were just as easy to be shot on the street as a Jew, so they would be scared to death here as they're being forced to perform. This is Branislav Ubermen. It's a carte de visite. If any of you are photographers, this is an incredible, I'm sure, one-of-a-kind portrait of Ubermen as a boy. And I must share with you, I'm going to find it quickly, and then I'm just going to go to questions, a story about Ubermen. That's from Amnon's desk looking at Moshe's workshop. That little room is Moshe's workshop. So this is the Ubermen violin. I'm gonna read this quickly to you. This is Joshua Bell, and I photographed him 2 years before I went to Tel Aviv to do this project. Many of you, I'm sure, know Bell. This is Ubermen's violin, which Joshua Bell owns today. I'm just going to read this page because it's a crazy story. Branislav Ubermen was born in Czechoslovakia, Poland in 1882. At the age of 4, his parents gave him a violin. By 10, he was studying under Joseph Joachim, who had been a protege of Felix Mendelssohn, Robert Schumann, and Franz Liszt. By the time Ubermen was 9, he was already known as a virtuoso. At 14, he was so proficient that Polish Count Władysław Zamoyski gifted him the family's 1713 Antonio Stradivarius violin. Stradivari of Cremona, Italy, made just 5 or 6 instruments that year. So get this, Johannes Brahms wrote his concerto for violin in D major, Opus 77, specifically for Joachim. They were friends. Once completed, it was so difficult to perform that Brahms modified the composition for Joachim to allow it to be passively playable. Following its debut in January 1st, 1879, other violinists wouldn't touch it, but Joachim was so impressed by his now 13-year-old student, Ubermen, that he persuaded Brahms to attend an 1896 performance of his concerto, but with Ubermen performing. Brahms was skeptical, but he grudgingly agreed to attend. Johann Strauss and Gustav Mahler were in attendance, as well as Brahms, who sat in the back, ready to leave if necessary. As soon as Ubermen began, Brahms was beside himself. He was seen by many in attendance, occasionally wiping his eyes through the performance. If it hadn't been prior to this evening, Ubermen's legacy was now set. So imagine those people hanging out at your concert when you're that age. I found these in the archives of the New York Times. This is when Toscanini arrived in Jerusalem and the day after their first performance. Interview with Asi. I asked her about why Jews are important, why violins are important to the Jews, and then we get into the story of her family. And this is a photograph I found at Yad Vashem of some of the Bilski partisans in the forest, and some of them are dressed like Nazis here. 2 of these books are going on to the Yad Vashem archive. And then finally, about my craft. more notes on selected photographs. This is Daniel Craig, James Bond playing Ossie's uncle in the movie. Liev Schreiber, the great Jewish actor from Canada, also played another uncle. And then Franz's bio and mine, and that's it. So let me stop sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. We have some questions in the chat. You're welcome to raise your hand if you want to be unmuted. You can put more questions in the chat. Bill has a question. How many cities has this collections and series of events visited? And do you know why the violin's so popular with this time period? I believe, do you mean the Holocaust period?
Actually, Avshi is going to have to answer this, what cities and nations they've gone to. But I can tell you that it's kind of scratching the surface what's happened to this point, because fortunately there are people hungry to experience it and learn more about it. And especially in Cleveland, I can't tell you how many tens of thousands of children were bused to Severance Hall to hear the Cleveland Orchestra members perform on them, and children perform on them. So it's carrying on. And while there's some legislation to rewrite history nationwide, to have the other side of the Holocaust, like in Texas, Ohio, believe it or not, even though we are a conservative state, we used to be a swing state. I'm in Cleveland, by the way. Ohio this year created legislation where the Holocaust has to be taught in every public school. It's now law. But I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. Why are they popular? Well, I asked Ossie that question. Amnon has a standard answer that he's actually quoting a composer, and I can't remember who that is, but basically it's the easiest instrument that is, incredibly beautiful to listen to grab and run when you have to leave your home. So that's a joke. I mean, obviously, but maybe there's a kernel of truth to it. I think of klezmer and the spirit, the ruach, the kind of energy, the celebration of that music, and it just seems to be in our soul. But I think Avshi will better answer that.
I just kind of add on to what you said about the cities. I know it's been certain places throughout the country, but I know it for Reading, it's been almost 2 years in the making for it to come here. And there's a waiting list for 2 years. I was just recently contacted by folks in Pittsburgh. It's going to go to Pittsburgh in October of 2023. So they're interested in what we're doing here in Reading because they're already planning and they're 2 years out. So there is that excitement, which is really great, but it hasn't been, it's been in a lot of places, but not as many as you would think, because I think you said there's 86 violins in the collection, 56 are traveling to us. Wow. So it's, which is a lot. Yeah.
Also, you should know that LA's was canceled. So Reading has a big jump on Los Angeles.
Well, I think they rescheduled. I'm pretty sure they're going from us to LA. So I think LA is after us now, but it was postponed for sure.
That's cool. I'm glad to hear that. But I was contacted by Pittsburgh. They're going to bring my exhibition. Oh, unfortunately, it's the 5th year anniversary of the Tree of Life shootings. That's the date they're having it.
That's their date they're doing.
Of course, that's the largest massacre of Jews in American history in America.
Yeah, for sure. So what year were you in Tel Aviv photographing Amnon?
I am sure that it was 6 years ago that I was there. And something, well, I'll just tell you a little backstory. I talked about it in my process. I went with one camera, one lens, one tripod. I used available light within his workshop and using a documentary approach. And my work half the time is documentary and the other half more conceptual. I went on a little adventure up north. I was finished and I went spelunking actually with a guide into a cave. It was really scary, but I had a realization there that I missed something, that there's something I really wanted to do. It was to kind of make portraits of violins. And you've seen some of them. One's right here on the cover. And so I called Amnon and I said, may I come back? I feel there's something I want to do. And it was incredible. He said, of course. And I came back and I took some of his task lamps, the Pixar animation, that beautiful, so some of those that he uses. And I went into the office while he was working in the workshop, and I brought, I think, 5 of the violins with me, and I spent an afternoon there, and it was there by myself, and there's no window in the space. And I had all the lights off except this one light that I used. I only used one. And I have to tell you, it was intense. This is after I'd spent all that time there. Here I am in these spaces, in this space with the lights down, holding these. And if someone was standing there talking to me, I don't think I would hear them. It was just intense and beautiful, and something I'll cherish forever. Amnon talks about the preciousness in that piece I read to you. You know, it's a lot, he says, and I get it. I really get it.
I think that's something that, oh no, go ahead. Finish.
I was going to say that the marks in the art world, there's a term called index. An index represents a mark that has been made that represents a history, an event. So a scratch on a violin or a violin case, you know, Amnon restores them, but some of the scratches he leaves because they're important. They represent that person who held it, cared for it, moved with it, whatever, during that time. And I look at each one of those, and I don't need to know the backstory. Our mind fills in the rest, but I know that's pseudo fiction. So anyhow.
Yeah, I just was gonna, you know, jump on what you were saying, in that I found it so interesting. You know, a lot of folks, when they hear about the violins, are like, oh, okay, great, we can see them on display. But I just love that you know, their philosophy is that they're meant to be touched and played, and they should be in the hands of people, and like as fragile and as, you know, like I can't think of the word right now, but I mean, as fragile and important as they are, they also need to be living, breathing instruments. And that's part of the legacy of these incredible stories, is when, you know, some of them we don't have a story for. I was working on, you know, all the signage for the exhibits, and some of them we don't know anything about them. But you can just imagine the things that they've gone through. And I just think that that's so powerful, that, you know, we're going to be in all these schools, we're going to be having all these events and concerts, and that these musicians and children will really get the opportunity to have that tactile experience with the violin, which I think will be so neat.
Absolutely. I can give you a little taste of, first of all, I think that Amnon gets that from Moshe. Moshe always was encouraging children and helping them. And I see that as part of, that's something that Amnon carries on, as does Avshi. But I was interviewing him after I came back, and I had sent him all the pictures that I had chosen, not for the book, but for the exhibition. And I was getting backstory on it. And it was like a 2-hour FaceTime. And then I heard that familiar buzz from the workshop for the door. And he said, excuse me. And he went and got it. And 3 or 4 or 5 minutes later, he came back. And I said, you know, is everything all right? He said, yeah, someone just wanted to pick up a Holocaust violin. And I asked if it was someone from the symphony, and he was like, no, I forget the age, but it was like a 15-year-old. And they were going to go perform at a like embassy. And he just handed it to them, and they went on their way. I mean, that kind of says it all, right? To him, that's the important thing, is having children perform on them to others. And the stories will get out as a result of the experience. It's different than reading a book or seeing a movie. It's way more, it penetrates your skin.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit that some stories are unknown. I'm sure in your time in Tel Aviv, you learned a lot of stories about the violence. Do you have one that kind of sticks out in your mind?
Well, I can tell you, I asked Asi that question, and she is the mom of the luthier and the husband of the luthier. Let me find it here. I loved her answer. It's actually a violin they don't have, but they wish they had it.
They wish they had, yeah.
Yeah, give me just 1 second.
Sure. While you're looking, I'm just going to read Vic's comment. Pennsylvania has a requirement. It's not a mandate, but a requirement that Holocaust, genocide, and human rights be taught in public schools K through 12. And it will be likely that we'll be one of the first states to actually implement the law. They've been working on it for the past year, and hopefully we'll be back. We'll be in by 2022. So hopefully, and I know locally we've had a lot of success. We'll be in 16 of the 18 school districts in Berks County doing educational outreach and reaching well over 5,000 students. So we're really excited to be bringing that opportunity to them while they're here. So,
wow, that's so nice to hear. I hope more states are doing that. I'm sorry, just one more moment.
Sure, not a problem. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. You're welcome to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you have a question as well. I'll just take this opportunity to plug our website. If you go to violinsofhopepa.org, you can find the full list of events happening over the 2 weeks. We have over 24 events happening. Like I mentioned, educational outreach, concerts. Tickets are still on sale for the Reading Symphony Orchestra concert, which is November 13th with Ubermen. There's a lot of great opportunities to see the violins. They will be on display at Goggleworks Center for the Arts, Alvernia University and Kutztown University for the full 2 weeks.
Great. So this isn't actually that story, but it's another one she told me that it's a violin they do have. So on a related note, if the Jews were supposed to give up their possessions, how could they bring instruments into the camps? I asked Ossie. Well, not everyone could. Very few did. There's this famous story of the violin that we have from France. A train was going from Lyon to Auschwitz. There were cattle cars, and there was a Jewish man with a violin in it. The train was stopped. They had to fix the road or the rails or something. And he threw the violin outside the little window in the cattle car and said he heard the workers outside talking to one another. He said, the place I'm going to, I'm not going to need a violin. Why don't you take my violin and keep it and save it? And then she goes on, and we have the violin. The violin was taken by these workers, and for about 70 years, it was in a workman's attic. When he died, his children sold it to a violin maker in the south of France, and he somehow knew about Amnon. It's a long story, but he gave it to us. It's like an endless story. You know, there were 8 different orchestras in Auschwitz. There's a women's orchestra led by a fantastic violinist named Alma Rose. Her father was a very famous violinist, Arnold Rose Rosenbaum. He was the first violinist of the Vienna Philharmonic, and he had a quartet named after him. He was related to Mahler, the composer. Alma was a violinist before the war. She had a women's orchestra that played kind of romantic music all over Europe. I'll just finish this up here. There's a beautiful book about her, biography, and she was the conductor of the women's orchestra in Auschwitz in Birkenau. She died on April 15, 1944 from illness, and she was the only woman in Auschwitz who was not called by a number. She was called Miss Frau, Lady Rose. Anyhow, one of the many stories.
Yeah, so that violin that was thrown from the train will be in Reading at Alvernia. So I encourage you to go see it. That's one of the stories that I think really stuck with me as well. That's a powerful one. Does anybody else have any other questions before we wrap up for the night? Daniel, thank you so much for sharing everything with us. We really appreciate it. I'm going to put the link back in to pre-order the book. You can also visit Daniel's website to learn more about the project. Again, violinsofhopepa.org has all the information about our exhibits and our events. It'll be here in Reading, November 1st to the 14th. And I also encourage you, if you're out in Ohio, to go visit the exhibit of Daniel's photography, which opens in Cleveland on November 14th. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Daniel. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much.